Good evening. It's June 7th, 2013. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'd like to welcome all of you viewing a live webcast with Mr. Lyndon Larouche. This is part of our weekly series, which occurs at 8 p.m. Eastern Time every Friday on LaRouchepack.com. Tonight, joining me in the studio will be Leandra Bernstein and Dennis Mason, both editors with LPAC TV, to pose some questions to Mr. Lyndon Larouche. But before I introduce them, I would like to give Mr. Larouche the podium. So without further ado, I give you Mr. Lyndon Larouche.
All right, I have a report which is given to me by people known to me on what the Obama administration is doing. And the report indicates three subjects: that the administration has been conducting spying against all kinds of people, and that this is actually threatening to bring about an ouster of Obama from the administration, and by groups opposing his re-election. Now, the second thing we have is that this comes on top of the new attacks from Obama on all kinds of people. And it's something where the executive branch cannot handle it. It's a threat of a real coup d'etat, which is not only exists, but exists in action already. The President of the United States is attempting to pull a coup d'etat, that is a takeover, a seizure of power, to become an absolute dictator. And what has happened, as many of you may know already, is that this week there has been a revolt in the Senate and other parts of the system which want this guy out. If you look carefully, however, there's a deeper aspect to this thing. The overall operation, of which Obama's a part, but he's only a part. We shouldn't exaggerate his importance in the structure. He's significant, yes, he represents this, he represents that, but that's not what the issue is. The issue is that he has been allowed to go to the point that he has absolute, total dictatorship over almost everybody. And what happened this week, of course, is the Parliament, or pardon me, I was thinking of the British Parliament, but the Congress has risen in revolt. And the pattern is that this spying operation that Obama's been running on behalf of the Queen of England has brought them to the point that people are now, on that account and several other related accounts which have been piling up, are ready to throw this bum out of the presidency. And that's where we stand now. We're on the edge. Is Obama going to succeed in making himself an absolute dictator over the United States? No, he's not going to succeed, because the British Queen is the one who's occupying the position. He's just her dummy. But the threat is that if he succeeds on her behalf and what he's put through, then there will be an absolute dictatorship in the United States, which will probably lead to a revolt, which means all kinds of bloodshed. So the best thing to do now is to get rid of this guy while he's highly unpopular.
Well, let me introduce Leandra Bernstein, who will present a question which Mr. Larouche just referred to from institutional circles inside Washington, and additionally some of the necessary background that needs to be known, taken into account.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Matt. Now, as background, I think most people have been well aware of the Washington Post coverage and the coverage from the London Guardian on the NSA collecting the phone records of millions of Verizon customers daily. Now, this story came out on Wednesday of this week, and it's been followed up every day, hour to hour, by new revelations. And the original report stated that the NSA is currently collecting the telephone records of millions of U.S. customers for Verizon, and that there was a copy of the order given to conduct this kind of dragnet was obtained by The Guardian as a leak on this program. And it was stated in the original report that the FISA court granted the order to the FBI, giving the government unlimited authority to obtain the data for a specified period on calls both within the United States and between the U.S. and other countries. Now, there was an immediate response, or there was a response to this from the head of the DNI, James Clapper, and he said that the two articles containing this leaked information had numerous inaccuracies, namely that we weren't spying on American calls. We weren't spying on just domestic calls. That's not what's in the law. It was only foreign calls, so only if you were making a call outside of the country. And he concluded in a press release by saying, "The unauthorized disclosure of information about this important and entirely legal program is reprehensible and risks important protections for the security of Americans." Now, today, Glenn Greenwald, who writes for The Guardian and was the original author of this report on the leaked information, made the point that as far as the government is concerned, the government is comprised of public servants. As public servants, we're supposed to know virtually everything about what they do. That's why we call them public servants. They are supposed to know virtually nothing about what we do. That's what makes us private citizens. So I thought that was an interesting case, and you have really incredible dragnet. Each of these providers have had in a different program. This is not the Verizon program, but what was leaked further was a data mining project that includes 9 of the largest internet servers that have had these providers have essentially provided the NSA with current and past data on, as far as we can tell, any of their users. Now, when this came up in the Congress, this came up in the Congress during just a routine Senate appropriations hearing, which included Eric Holder, where Eric Holder was put in the hot seat, and Senator Kirk asked Eric Holder, I just want to talk about the Verizon scandal. He says, "I want to ask, could you assure us that no phones inside the Capitol were monitored of members of Congress that would give a future executive branch, if they started pulling this kind of thing up, that would give them unique leverage over the legislature?" And in response to this question, Eric Holder his mouth started moving. And he said, I'll be happy to answer this question, but in a closed hearing. To which Senator Kirk replied, "I'd interrupt you and say the correct answer would be to say no. We stayed within our lane, and I'm assuring you we did not spy on members of Congress." Of course, that's not the answer that Eric Holder gave. So, just further, in the coverage from Glenn Greenwald, you have the identification of what he termed new domestic authoritarianism. And as many people know, this week is on June 6th, it was the 69th anniversary of D-Day. And in this article, Greenwald writes, "Few Americans believe that they live in a police state. Indeed, many would be outraged at the suggestion. Yet the everyday fact that the police have the right to monitor the communications of all its citizens in secret is a classic hallmark of a state that fears freedom as well as championing it." Ironically, The Guardian's revelations were published 69 years to the day since U.S. and British soldiers launched the D-Day invasion of Europe. The young Americans who fought their way up the Normandy beaches rightly believed they were helping free the world from a tyranny. They did not think that they were making it safe for their own rulers to take such sweeping powers as these over their descendants. So with that as background, I'd like to get to the question that came in from an institutional source. The source asked, "Mr. LaRouche, the most recent revelation about the Obama administration gathering personal data on hundreds of millions of Americans without any due process comes at a most damaging moment. The scandals that preceded these latest news accounts have already shown that the administration has been spying on journalists, and the IRS has been targeting political groups opposing President Obama's re-election. The pattern is one of denial of due process. On the one hand, in a recent speech on the drone kill program, President Obama claimed that the U.S. is now safer than at any time since the original 9/11 attack. Yet today, in defending himself over the mass spying scandal, he argued that the threat of terrorism warrants the extraordinary spying on all Americans. Can the president have it both ways? What recourse do the American people have? What should Congress do? So far, Congress has shown little appetite or competence in dealing with the pileup of executive branch scandals. We're still awaiting much information about Fast and Furious. So what is your assessment of this process?"
Well, it's not good for Obama. Obama has gone, shall we say, too far. And the accumulation of what he's been doing in intentional crimes against our citizens and against our system. He says, "I can run everything. Trust me. Don't interfere with what I'm doing. I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing." And but this is done already. It's all at the streets and around the streets of the world already. Obama is on the edge of being thrown out of office. That's exactly what we're picking up. He's ready to be thrown out of office. Whether that charming event will occur or not has not been decided. But if you take the proceedings that occurred in the Senate, in the answer to this colloquy, that colloquy already indicates that despite a few dissidents who still are covering up for Obama, the majority of the Senate is for a house cleaning now. The time has come that the lawful process that dealt with a president earlier and threw him out of office back in the early 1970s, the same treatment with probably an extra kick or two is coming to Obama.
Okay, well, I have a question about the recent appointment as the head of national security, Susan Rice, and the nomination to the ambassadorship to the UN, Samantha Power. Now, both Rice and Power are advocates of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which, like we see with the bail-in policy, where that's the financial policy of the empire, responsibility to protect is their strategic and military policy. This was put forward at the turn of the millennium by Tony Blair and was followed up by George Soros. In a 2004 article in Foreign Policy, George Soros wrote, and the title of the article was "The People's Sovereignty as regards right to protect." He said, "Sovereignty is an anachronistic concept originating in bygone times when society consisted of rulers and subjects, not citizens. It became the cornerstone of international relations with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The rulers of a sovereign state have a responsibility to protect the state's citizens. When they fail to do so, the responsibility is transferred to the international community." And then he continues, he says, "If governments abuse the authority entrusted to them and citizens citizens have no opportunity to correct such abuses, outside interference is justified. By specifying that sovereignty is based on the people, the international community can penetrate nation-states' borders." Now, in a 2004 forum, Power commented on a book that she had written, and she had said that my book and my research were utterly unsustainable on the free market. If I hadn't been able to get a grant from George Soros and the Open Society Institute, there's no way that I could have done the kind of investigative reporting that I needed to do. And then also keep in mind that in 2004, Soros put together some $60,000 for Obama's campaign to the Senate at the time, and Power was brought on board Obama's team then in the Senate. Now, so you have, on the one hand, Samantha Power. On the other hand, you have Susan Rice. I mean, we've seen with this question of Benghazi and the talking points and all of that, but also keep in mind earlier on in the late 90s, you had atrocities in Africa under her tenure as Secretary for African Affairs, which, you had the bombing of a pharmaceutical plant, Sudan, the removal of over 1 million refugees in the Great Lakes region of Africa by the armies of Uganda, Rwanda. And she had said at the time that, they know how to deal with that. The only thing we have to do is look the other way. So yesterday, the neocons are very happy with the prospect of these two coming into the administration. McCain gave a speech raving about Syria at the Brookings Institute, where he said, he has great new hopes for the team of Samantha Power and Susan Rice, particularly given that Power had great responsibility in overthrowing Gaddafi. So if you could, I'd like you to address this factor in the strategic situation around the Obama presidency.
I think you ought to probably minimize the significance of that. Now, I've been forecasting for a long time, and I've been right all of those times when I've made a public forecast. Now, doing that, take the one case. In 1968, I first uttered a forecast saying that we were headed toward a collapse, that is an actual depression, a general depression of the United States economy. That occurred in the beginning of summer 1971. I was the only person, as a forecaster, as an economist, who published a forecast on this subject of 68, which came to 71. No other economist in the United States had anything but a contrary forecast. This led to an event in the course of the same year in which there was a big event in New York City where all kinds of economists were assembled, including some leading ones from Britain, and they were all defeated in a debate with me. I've had a number of these kinds of incidents before. The tendency when people make mistakes on forecasting is they try to make mechanical forecasts. They take mechanical factors and they don't realize that what happens is most turns in history occur as total surprises to most of the people who have been experiencing that. So therefore, you're going to forecast. You don't forecast on the basis of statistical trends. You don't ignore statistical trends, but you don't forecast on the basis of that. What happens is a social process in which people are convinced that something is true, it happens not to be true. But they believe it's true. They can quote you on all these principles and all these experts and so forth who told you that this could never happen or it will certainly happen, one of the two. And yet, despite that, reality reacts suddenly with a complete disregard and contempt for all those forecasters. Now, that's what I've been up to ever since I made my first forecast in 1968. And that worked out well, too. All of my forecasts of that type have worked out. And I don't make forecasts unless I'm certain. And I know when I'm certain, and I know when I'm not. So if I don't know what I'm talking about, I shut up. If I do know what I'm talking about, I will say it at the proper time. And this is such a time. What has happened now? Don't look at all these facts. Forget them. Because they're facts that are stated, there are facts that are unstated. The unstated facts remain unstated, and the stated facts remain asserted. So therefore, what's your forecast worth? If you can't tell the difference between what you should recognize and what you don't. And we're now in such a time, I can tell you precisely in those terms, that we've come to a point where this Obama has abused, brutally abused, the United States and its citizens and its economy in every imaginable way. He's even worse in terms of his performance than the previous president, who was a real bum, who got us into some horrible circumstances and was a real thug. He wasn't very bright, but he was a thug. So we are now in that kind of situation where people are saying, and you saw it in the Congress this week, what happened? There was a sudden revolt in the Senate against this operation. A sudden revolt. They were sitting there quietly listening to this crap. And then suddenly, boom, things changed. And the rioting began. What? What are you doing? What are you doing to us? You're doing this to us? And that was what rang out in the Congress. We had also a refraction on that from Britain, where voices in Britain of some significance made the same kind of observation. What has happened is that Obama was never really good. He was never really liked very much. But people were afraid of him. And when important people are terribly afraid of what some bum can do, and Obama did a lot of cruel things to intimidate people. And we come to the point, yes, a few senators did try to cover up for Obama, but most of them did not. So we've come to a point of ripeness where Obama is ready to be ushered from the exits or thrown out of the exits. And we've come to one of those times where either Obama is capable of imposing an actual over-dictatorship over the American people and the institutions, or he is going to be thrown out.
All right. Now, this is a question that has come up as a result of some meetings that we've had on Glass-Steagall and the material published on the nature of the Dodd-Frank Act. And what's been happening is, in certain cases, there has been a very positive response to the fact of positive in the sense of strong concern to the fact that Dodd-Frank loops the United States, hooks the United States into an international bail-in regime, and as it stands, the Dodd-Frank Act is still the shining example for other international bail-in regimes, which are being worked on really as we speak within the European Union. So while we have gotten stunned recognition that this is in fact the case, there's also been a lot of resistance. In particular, there was a meeting in Washington, D.C. earlier this week where we were asked not so nicely to leave the office of a congressman because we insisted that the implications of enacting Title II, the Orderly Liquidation Authority of Dodd-Frank, would result in the death of millions of Americans through economic deprivation. And this aide refused to hear it, said, no, that's not the case. That can't be the case. What you're saying is over the top. That was one response. Another response from a representative of the AFL-CIO at a conference earlier this week was that Title II of Dodd-Frank is, in fact, a good thing, and that in 2008, the financial system needed support. So the question wasn't whether the government should act, but how it should act. And he responded by saying the big question is, will Title II be used in the case of the insolvency of one of these G-SIFIs? Will it be used? And there's a vulnerability if it is used because it involves cross-border bank resolution. Will other nations invoke the same authorities? So that's a vulnerability. And he went on to say that if another SIFI went down and we didn't have Title II to invoke, it would mean severe damage for our democracy. Now, one more response, because I'll just throw in right now that these are they're clearly lies. People are clearly lying, and you get into a situation. People often throw lies at you as an organizer to shut you up. They lie to you to get you to just leave me alone. I'll lie to you. Just leave me alone. So that's happening now. This other response came in from a representative to one of our activists out in a western state, saying on Glass-Steagall, the most popular reason given to justify bringing back Glass-Steagall's separation is to safeguard FDIC-insured deposits from being lost through risky activities. However, others argue that while Gramm-Leach-Bliley allows deposit-taking banks to affiliate with securities firms through holding companies, depositors and taxpayers are protected because affiliates can't take capital out of the bank. So, because these are responses that are coming up in the organizing situation, I would like you to just take the opportunity to put yourself in the shoes of our activists, and what do we do in response to these kinds of lines?
Right. Well, first of all, anyone who knows anything about economy, who is not utterly confused by all the garbage that's thrown at their face and so forth, we should recognize that essentially what has happened, if you look at employment characteristics, if you look at the value of income, that is by taking the inflation account into account, and so forth, what you're seeing is that over the entire period since 1971, the United States has been in a clear decline, with ebbs and flows in the decline. So the conditions of life of the average American is worse by the year since 1971. It didn't start then. The figures were still fake. You had the beginning of the process was the assassination of John F. Kennedy as president. That created the authorization for going into an Indochina war, which lasted for about a decade. This destroyed the morality and much of the economy of the United States. That is, though some money was being put into things which would boost income in certain categories, the basic income of production and real wealth was being undermined. And we saw that with the decline of the space program. Everything was declining. From 1968 on, everything was declining. And the war in Indochina extended this problem. That is, the collapse was greater. Now you had a new president. We had, some foolish presidents in the meantime. One we threw out of office, fortunately. But others who should have been thrown out of office. And what happened, we had a new president, but the new president was outflanked. He had some good intentions, but he was outflanked. I was collaborating with him. He was outflanked. And he made his statement. He stood by it to the end of his career, probably virtually to the end of his life, the SDI. And so that was our policy. But we were losing. The income was losing. What was gaining was a certain kind of income, Wall Street type income. So we had an inflation in Wall Street type income and similar kinds of swindles, outright swindles, drug swindles, all kinds of screwy things. Really terrible, stupid things. So we have been actually in a constant... Now, anybody who has lived through the equivalent of 3+ generations, as I have, knows from experience that that is the record. That if you divide the thing between the gamblers and Wall Street are the gamblers. Now, they have a lot of money involved. They have a lot of options involved. But we're talking about production. We're talking about the production of food, the production of everything. That is real things. We're talking about health care and other real things. The real things have been suffering. They are going down. What is controls everything is Wall Street and its European extensions from Britain. So we are in a breakdown of the whole world. So therefore, with these guys, if Wall Street is taking over the economy totally, as what they're saying, that's what Glass-Steagall will defeat. And what they're doing is nothing but hyperinflation. The rate of inflation now, just look at the price of anything. Look at salaries of people. Compare that with the prices of anything that they buy. And look at the condition of income. Look at the housing. Look at the food supplies. Look at the food. Your food supply is being destroyed. By whom? Obama. Obama is a leader in destroying the food supply of the United States. Cattle, grains, all these things are being destroyed and turned into what? Gasoline, kerosene, instead of food. People are starving. The starving is going to get worse. And you're going to say that these guys who have triumphed in pushing through these swindles over all these years, that they are suddenly going to find a cheerful heart and go to your door and give you all Christmas presents all year round or something like that? These are the world's worst swindlers and the most successful ones so far, unfortunately. So the time has come that anybody who would support these kinds of policies that Wall Street wants could be lynched. Because the hatred against such people is there. It's piling up. It's piling up. You see it in Europe. It's piling up. The only thing that prevents explosions of that type is people are too scared to fight. And when there's a point in time where the fear of the danger of fighting and the sense of desperation if you don't fight changes the whole direction of history. And that's where we are now. Mankind will either go into something worse than a worldwide Nazi system, which is what's threatened. That's what this means. Dodd-Frank means that. If it were actually implemented in any form, it would be the authorship of genocide inside the United States and beyond. But who's behind it? Well, the people who are gamblers, the Wall Street gamblers. They all want the gambling proceeds. They don't think in terms of food. They don't think in terms of lives of people. They don't think in terms of health care. They think of their money and their money per se. They care nothing about the human being. And they're not prepared to do anything about it. Well, the point is, sometimes justice imposes a penalty upon the abuser. And the time has come. I don't think any of us who are not gutless and who are sane would give a dime for Wall Street.
Okay. Well, on the topic of the food crisis, a question about agriculture, resource management, and green policy. We attended a congressional hearing on the renewable fuel standard, which is the ethanol mandate, where a White House official was being grilled about at what point can that mandate be lifted, as it is quite obviously having a direct impact on the food supply. To which the committee didn't receive an answer. The representative pressed the official on whether or not there is some sort of standard, some kind of a bottom or a baseline for the production of the people and for the agriculture, by which you would determine that the mandate needs to be lifted. To which the official answered, no, there's not. There isn't any such thing, such that when push comes to shove, as it stands right now, there is no protection for the people from starvation. From a direct shortage of food. It's being diverted to the ethanol. Now that's apparent, that's very visible. But there's another aspect, I think, which isn't so visible, which amounts to my thinking as a salting of the earth kind of policy. You see, corn is quite an intense biological process in terms of the biogenic migration of atoms, what actually happens in the growing of the corn. And we have had, historically very fertile topsoil across the nation, but we've been depleting that resource at an accelerating rate, running our crops based on a market value. What's going to get the money? Now, over time, especially in the lower latitudes, the ability to have a bountiful harvest becomes less and less. That's just based on the fertility of the topsoils. That doesn't take into account things like extreme weather, pests, plant diseases, blight, these kinds of things. So we're on the cusp of not only sacrificing ourselves today in the name of the markets instead of feeding the people, we're also sacrificing our posterity in that, in essence, we're burning through our soils. Now, along with this, we have the case, for example, in Iowa where they were digging a well for water for agricultural uses, and instead of the normal depth of 150 to 300 feet where they would usually strike water, they had to go down to 900 feet, and they weren't very successful even at that depth. So the attempted wells in this case were abandoned. Now, the groundwater complexes in that area, are complex, but and the nearby wells are doing okay. But the farmers, the drilling companies, geologists are very concerned about the fact that there was one young farmer who was having a well drilled for a hog raising complex. He couldn't find sufficient water, even drilling to that depth, so he canceled his plans altogether. And a few other hog companies have had their existing wells go dry. Some farmers have had to resort to hauling in water. Another had to use a farm lake that he had built previously. But now keep in mind here, this isn't out west where it's arid and very dry. This is well east of the 20-inch rainfall line. So we have the capability in principle of dealing with these problems. We can, in the case of soil, we can re-enrich the farmland, but that's not necessarily a profitable thing to do for a Monsanto or a Cargill, and it does go directly against the policy of population reduction which is in play right now. On the water question, we have NWAPA to address that crisis. We could go to nuclear desalination to get fresh water if we choose. So in principle, these aren't crises which are out of the power of mankind to address. The real crisis seems to be more that the empire is out to kill us. So if you could address this problem.
Well, in terms of all kinds of normal response to a disaster in these areas, in topical areas, if you're just going to do that, you're going to fail. You're going to have to actually go back to a deeper approach. We're going to have to change. First of all, the first thing we're going to have to do, because of the deprivation, we're going to have to cancel all conversion of food into fuel. All food into fuel ends. That's the first thing. And if you don't do that, you are not serious. And anyone who doesn't do that is a criminal, morally a criminal. So therefore, we're going to shut down the foolish people. That's what we have to do. Now, we also have a deeper problem. What you say when you talk about all this deep well stuff, what you're talking about is the fact that the stupidity, the criminality has been underway for the better part of a century. Since the 1970s, and especially since the 1980s, the late 1980s, and the entry of George H.W. Bush into the presidency, and then later his two sons into the presidency twice, and now this bum, Obama, you take how long a period that is. 4 years each term. And it's over that span that the resources of the United States, which were then rich in these categories, are almost non-existent now. So we're not going to be able to get out there with a good old pump and pump up the water that's needed. Is not enough. But there are other methods we can apply. And they imply technologies which are available to us. We can do it. But it means we've got to get away from the green technology. What is going to kill Americans is green technology. As long as the greenies are triumphant in raping the economy and destroying it, destroying productivity, then we don't have a chance. You're doomed. But then what's the green technology? Where'd the green come from? Well, I know where it came from. I know the names of the people who created it. And they were all criminals. I followed that since, again, for almost 50 years of how this policy was put into place. And for 50 years, we've been destroying the world, or a good part of it. So now what we're going to have to do is simply throw these bums and their policies out. It's a national emergency. That's what it is for the United States. We have to make some radical changes quickly to get people moving upward. In other words, you cannot just try to put a few drops of water down a deep, dry well. You've got to generate some growth in the water. Well, that we can do. But it means we have to sacrifice some of this damn green foolishness to do it. We also have to employ people in productive labor, not foolish make work, or these kinds of things. We've come to the point that the United States has been ruined, actually I could say ruined since the assassination of what? Of John F. Kennedy. The United States has actually been on a decline since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the long war that we got into, which is totally unnecessary, totally contrary to all principle. Douglas MacArthur, probably the greatest genius military genius of our century, or our past century, warned against this. We understood Truman was no damn good. That's a fact. But what we did is we put up with him, and what we did, we went to a thermonuclear option. It was firstly a nuclear weapons. We dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, both cases. Neither should have been done. Japan had already been defeated. The dropping of those nuclear bombs had no effect on winning the war, but quite the contrary. So we have been moving in directions, including unnecessary wars. Wars which are not wars. You can no longer fight wars in conventional wars. If anyone's thinking about going to a world war now, they are clinically insane or clinically dead because they don't know what they're doing. The only kind of a war, we're now in a thermonuclear conflict syndrome. If we try to push any kind of warfare, as in the Middle East region, as now, say, the Syria situation, if you try to push that to the point that the Israelis get stupid and get into that kind of operation, or anything like that, if we go to to a nuclear crisis, it will be a thermonuclear crisis. And all leading experts in the military department know that. But what is happening? This administration in the United States is pushing in that direction. The British are doing it more obviously. We have some people like Dempsey and so forth who are warned us against this nonsense. But we are not far from the threat of going to thermonuclear war. And thermonuclear war lasts for about 1 hour and a half. And a lot is over.
Well, that brings us to a conclusion of the questions that we have for tonight. I think Mr. LaRouche's forecasting record, as you said, has been made very clear over the last almost 50 years. So what he said tonight, I think, needs to be taken very seriously by everybody who heard. So I would like to thank Leandra. I would like to thank Dennis for joining me in the studio tonight. I'd like to thank you, Lynn, for what you said. And I'd like to thank everybody who was watching. Good night.